Rebecca is a 2020 British romantic thriller film directed by Ben Wheatley from a screenplay by Jane Goldman, Joe Shrapnel, and Anna Waterhouse. The film is based on the 1938 novel of the same name by Daphne du Maurier and stars Lily James, Armie Hammer, Kristin Scott Thomas, Keeley Hawes, Ann Dowd, and Sam Riley. Rebecca was released in select theaters on October 16, 2020, and digitally on Netflix on October 21, 2020. It received mixed reviews from critics. While working as a companion to Mrs. Van Hopper, a rich American woman on holiday in Monte Carlo, an unnamed naive young woman in her early 20s becomes acquainted with a wealthy Englishman, Maxim de Winter, a widower. After a fortnight of courtship, she agrees to marry him and, after the wedding and honeymoon, accompanies him to his mansion in Cornwall, the beautiful estate Manderley. Mrs. Danvers, the sinister housekeeper, was profoundly devoted to the first Mrs. de Winter, Rebecca, who died in a boating accident about a year before Maxim and the second Mrs. de Winter met. She continually attempts to undermine Mrs. de Winter psychologically, subtly suggesting to her that she will never attain the beauty, urbanity, and charm her predecessor possessed. Whenever Mrs. de Winter attempts to make changes at Manderley, Mrs. Danvers describes how Rebecca ran it when she was alive. Each time Mrs. Danvers does this, she implies that Mrs. de Winter lacks the experience and knowledge necessary for running an important estate. Cowed by Mrs. Danvers' imposing manner and the other members of West Country society's unwavering reverence for Rebecca, Mrs. de Winter becomes isolated. Mrs. de Winter is soon convinced that Maxim regrets his impetuous decision to marry her and is still deeply in love with the seemingly perfect Rebecca. The climax occurs at Manderley's annual costume ball. Mrs. Danvers manipulates Mrs. de Winter into wearing a replica of the dress shown in a portrait of one of the house's former inhabitants, hiding the fact that Rebecca wore the same costume to much acclaim shortly before her death. Mrs. de Winter has a drummer announce her entrance using the name of the lady in the portrait, Caroline de Winter. When Mrs. de Winter shows Maxim the dress, he angrily orders her to change. Shortly after the ball, Mrs. Danvers reveals her contempt for the new Mrs. de Winter, believing she is trying to replace Rebecca, and reveals her deep, unhealthy obsession with the dead woman. Mrs. Danvers tries to get Mrs. de Winter to commit suicide by encouraging her to jump out of the window. However, she is thwarted at the last moment by the disturbance occasioned by a nearby shipwreck. A diver investigating the wrecked ship's hull's condition also discovers the remains of Rebecca's sailing boat, with her decomposed body still on board. This discovery causes Maxim to confess to Mrs. de Winter that his marriage to Rebecca was a sham. Rebecca, Maxim reveals, was a cruel and selfish woman who manipulated everyone around her into believing her to be the perfect wife and a paragon of virtue. On the night of her death, she told Maxim that she was pregnant with another man's child, which she would raise under the pretense that it was Maxim's, and he would be powerless to stop her. In a rage, Maxim shot her through the heart, then disposed of her body by placing it in her boat and sinking it at sea. Mrs. de Winter thinks little of Maxim's murder confession but is relieved to hear that Maxim has always loved her and never Rebecca. Rebecca's boat is raised, and it is discovered to have been deliberately sunk. An inquest brings a verdict of suicide. However, Rebecca's first cousin and lover, Jack Favell, attempts to blackmail Maxim, claiming to have proof that she could not have intended suicide based on a note she sent to him the night she died. It is revealed that Rebecca had had an appointment with a doctor in London shortly before her death, presumably to confirm her pregnancy. When the doctor is found, he reveals that Rebecca had cancer and would have died within a few months. Furthermore, due to the malformation of her uterus, she could never have been pregnant. Maxim assumes that Rebecca, knowing that she would die, manipulated him into killing her quickly. Mrs. Danvers had said after the inquiry that Rebecca feared nothing except dying a lingering death. Maxim feels a great sense of foreboding and insists on driving through the night to return to Manderley. However, before he comes in sight of the house, it is clear from a glow on the horizon and wind-borne ashes that it is ablaze. Mrs. Danvers commits suicide by drowning herself in the sea. Before that, she curses Mrs. de Winter of never knowing happiness. Contrary to that, Mrs. de Winter finds herself content in fighting for love, and together, she and Maxim are in search of their dream home. It was announced in November 2018 that Lily James and Armie Hammer had been cast in the film, to be directed by Ben Wheatley, which Netflix would distribute, 1. In May 2019, Kristin Scott Thomas, Keeley Hawes, Ann Dowd, Sam Riley and Ben Crompton joined the cast of the film. 2-3. Filming began on June 3, 2019. 4. Cranbourne Manor in Dorset citation needed, and Hartland Quay in Devon were used for filming in July 2019. 5. In total, Rebecca was filmed at 6 different manors or estates. Along with Cranbourne, they used Hatfield House for the interior hallways, Mapperton for Manderley's back garden, which is open for the public sometimes unlike the actual manor, Loseley Park for Manderley's east and west wings master bedrooms and staircases, Petworth House for one of the corridor full of marble statues and paintings, and lastly Osterley Park for Manderley's kitchen. 6. Rebecca was released into select British cinemas on October 16, 2020, and digitally on Netflix worldwide on October 21, 2020. 7-8.